Hey guys, welcome back to Mr. Nell's Social 9 podcast. This is Chapter 4, Episode 2, and in this chapter we're talking about the numbered treaties. So a quick recap. Chapter 4 is about collective rights, which are rights given to specific groups of people. So Chapter 3 focused on Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which are rights and freedoms for everybody, every citizen in Canada. Chapter 4, collective rights, rights for specific groups of people. And we'll be going through those groups throughout this chapter. So this episode's focusing almost entirely on the numbered treaties with First Nations. So I'll be reading you a few stories. You can follow along in your textbook on pages 125. It also helps connect with the second assignment that you'll be doing. So the second assignment is from reading pages 124 to 127. And I'll read those with you now to help you go through it. And let's do this together. So, page 124, what exactly are the numbered treaties? Historic agreements that affect the rights and identity of some of First Nations in Canada. The numbered treaties have roots in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Britain made the proclamation at the end of the 7 Years' War as it sought to establish control over lands in North America formerly claimed by France. The proclamation recognized First Nation rights to land and established the principle of making treaties with First Nations through peaceful negotiation. So things are looking pretty good right now. Other laws also affect the collective rights of First Nations, including the Indian Act and Section 35 of the Constitution. We'll be going more in detail on the Indian Act on Episode 3. The numbered treaties were agreements between the Queen and First Nations at the beginning. First Nations agreed to share their lands and resources in peace. Canada's government agreed in terms covering First Nations education, reserves, annuities, and other matters. The terms differ from treaty to treaty, and you'll see the charts on page 125 as well, because they differ in Alberta and all across the country. But as you can see, it started off pretty well. For First Nations, the numbered treaties are sacred, nation-to-nation agreements, solemnly made that cannot be changed without their agreement. Treaty rights and citizenship go together for First Nations now, in the past, and into the future. When you see the term sacred for First Nations, this is how the treaties can be, perspectives can play a huge part here. Where the government may have seen it more as a business-like agreement regarding reserves, education, etc., the First Nations at the time thought of it as a sacred agreement. So things can be taken much differently. And so again, on page 125, you can see some of the terms for Treaties 6, 7, and 8, which are the ones that are in Alberta. I'm on page 126 now. So First Nations in the West and Canada negotiated the numbered treaties for many reasons. There's just some pictures here. You can kind of look at it on your own. Here's some pretty neat pictures on the railway graveyard. But it's go ahead and read that on your own time on page 126. On page 127, we have where it's talking about how perspectives play a role in the interpretation of the treaties. So you'd think a treaty is basically like an agreement. Well, if it was written down, you'd think it'd be pretty easy to keep track of. However, in previous years, you might have learned that for the most part, First Nations keep their records through oral tradition, like handing it down through generation to generation, whereas the government kept written copies where they accurately kept, who knows, right? You're going back a long, long way. Canada's government believes First Nations gave up their land under the treaties. First point, gave up their land. Many First Nations disagree, especially since their worldviews do not think of land as something anyone can own or give up. So even though they did say at the beginning that they were giving up their land, they don't think anyone can own land per se. So when you think about the very first agreements they made, these first treaties, I always try to think about both perspectives. So they made the agreement to give up their land. The First Nations at the time are thinking, well, no one owns land, so we're winning this deal for sure because we're going to get education, annuities, which are yearly sums of money. And again, they don't think you can own land. So already, the very beginning, we're getting some. The perspectives are causing a rift in how the treaties are decided. So this is a quote from a First Nations at the time. To us, the land is a legacy, not a commodity. It is every part of our culture. The land from which our culture springs is like the water and air. It is one and indivisible. So basically saying again that no one can own land. The government of Canada obviously had different thoughts about that. So again, First Nations recorded the treaties in their oral histories in their own languages. Canada's government recorded the treaties in writing in English. The oral and written records disagree on key aspects of the treaties. So you can see where these problems start to arise between the government and First Nations at the time, where one has written copies, it's in English, they don't really speak English that well at the time, other ones don't have written copies at all, it's keeping in oral tradition in their language. So things are going to get messed up. If you played the game telephone, picture that a million times more difficult. I'm now on page 128. So once you get to page 128, you're going to assignment 3. Assignment 2 is only page 124 to 127, a few paragraphs. Assignment 3, the numbered treaties timeline, is a bit more, will take a bit more time. But if you go to page 128 is where it starts. So it says the next 7 pages, sounds like a lot of reading. It's not that much because each page has little paragraphs on it. The next 7 pages present a timeline spanning more than a century. Here's how to use the timeline. You'll see at the beginning, the top of each page presents information about the perspectives of First Nations on the numbered treaties. Most of these perspectives come from the First Nations in Alberta, covered by Treaties 6, 7, and 8. That's the majority of our focus. This whole chapter will be on Alberta specifically, collective rights First Nations. So Treaties 6, 7, and 8. You're going to analyze these for evidence that First Nations viewed and continue to view the treaties as nation-to-nation agreements that establish rights. It says use an organizer like the one below, which I already created for you. It's already in the Google Classroom, so you don't have to create your own unless you really want to. But the top part of the page, it's all like a shade of green on all the pages. So the top part is the First Nations perspective on the specific treaties. Okay, so on the left assignment there, it says perspective First Nations at the very top here. That's where you're going to put what did the First Nations think about the treaty at the time? And when it says affirm First Nations, that's basically saying, do you think it's good for First Nations? Why or why not? Did they think it was good for them at the time? And then on the other side, which is going to be in the back of your sheet, or if you print it off, or the other side of the sheet down low, the same thing, the bottom of the page, that's in a shade of blue, same treaties, the government's perspective at the time. So this little assignment here is basically just trying to find out at what points did the government and First Nations see eye to eye on the treaties? Like when were they in agreement? If the First Nations thought it was good for them and the government thought it was good for them and everything was going well, at a certain time, then we're looking pretty good. And as you go through the timelines, you'll see where it starts to separate, where these disagreements happened on the same treaty, but different perspectives on the treaty. Okay, so I'll read it with you guys, but go ahead and read it on your own if you like. So the first one here, again, the bottom of the page presents information about the views of Canada's government on the numbered treaties. Analyze these for evidence that the government has had different views of treaty rights over time. So again, 2 different organizers, like same assignment but 2 different sets. They look the same, but they're not. One is on the perspective of the First Nations, the other is on the perspective of the government at the time. So starting off in 1876, which is the very top of the first assignment on both, you can even have both out at the same time. A perspective from Treaty 6. What we speak of will last as long as the sun shines and the river runs. We are looking to the future of our children's children. And then you can take a look there's a picture of a medal on page 129. and it looks like it's a like a European at the time shaking hands with the First Nations. So that's all you get. You don't get a whole lot of info on the perspective from Treaty 6 in 1876 from the First Nations. Okay, but is it sound? It's sounding like it's a good thing or a bad thing at the time. 1876 government perspective. What I will promise and what I believe and hope you will take is to last as long as the sun shines and the rivers flow. I see the Queen's counselors taking the Indian by the hand, saying, "We are brothers. We will lift you up. We will teach you if you will learn." The cunning of the white man. I see Indians gathering. I see gardens growing and houses building. I see them receiving money from the Queen's commissions to purchase clothing for their children. At the same time, I see them enjoying their hunting and fishing as before. I see them retaining their old modes of living, with the Queen's gift in addition. So, right now we got 1876. I'm not throwing out answers here to your assignment, but both the government and First Nations look like they're on pretty similar terms right here, and they're both working together, and they both want what's best for each other. So, right now, we're looking pretty good. Moving on. Page 130. So now we're getting back to the First Nations perspective on Treaty 6. First Nations were and are independent people with their own process of government and ways of organizing their nations. 1876, the Indian Act, the government perspective. So I'm just going top page, bottom page. Canada's Parliament passed the Indian Act, which made rules about the lives of First Nations people without consulting them. So the government passed a bill called the Indian Act, and so this is in 1876. They didn't even consult or ask the First Nations about their opinion on this whatsoever. At the time, Canada's government viewed First Nations people as people who needed guidance. This connected to Canada's colonial past and the attitude that European ways were superior to the ways of other people. At the bottom of page 130, you see how does the excerpt from the Indian Act below reflect this? Basically, so at the time, think of this as a perspective of they weren't purposely trying to be mean to First Nations at the time, right? They literally just thought they were better than everybody else on Earth, better than everybody else. So they thought, wow, we're just helping. We're helping people by making them like us. Page 131. So First Nations side again, a perspective from Treaty 7. This photo shows two Siksika school children. Their mother, Mary, running rabbit, stands behind them on the right. The Siksika Nation is part of Treaty 7. The two women have taken the children to a spiritual leader who has drawn circles on their faces. The circle represents the cycle of the sun from sunrise to sunset. The circle shows that this family values its culture and identity. 1879, residential schools. Canada's government commissioned Member of Parliament MP Nicholas Davin to recommend how to provide First Nations with education and to assimilate them at the same time. So here's where things really start going wrong. They asked this MP what his advice was, and they wanted to educate, which they agreed to in the treaty, so good so far, and to assimilate them at the same time. Essentially meaning, how can we give them the education that we promised, while also basically making them forget their own ways and becoming just like the Europeans. So they recommended residential schools. Residential schools removed children from their families and disrupted their connections to their languages, cultures, and identities. So you got a little quote here. Residential schools allow aggressive civilization by separating children from their parents. Residential schools make a certain degree of civilization within the reach of Indians. Despite the deficiencies of their race, the Indians realize they will disappear. So this is a quote from actually the MP, Nicholas Darwin at the time. That's on the page, bottom of page 131. So pretty crazy stuff people are saying at the time. Basically, we'll take you from your parents, so you lose your culture, you can't speak your language, you have to speak English or French, depending on where the school was, without a choice. So slowly over time, start forgetting their own culture. Page 132. First Nations perspective. A perspective from Treaties 6, 7, and 8. First Nations in Alberta organized the Indian Association of Alberta. So this is now they're starting to realize things are not going great at all, so they're starting their own organization in 1939. The aims of the Indian Association of Alberta will be number one, to maintain treaty rights. Number two, to advance the social and economic welfare of Indian people. 3, to secure better educational facilities and opportunities. And number 4, to cooperate with federal, provincial, and local governments for the benefit of Indians. 1946, still staying at the First Nations perspective, perspective from Treaty 6. We made treaties with Great Britain, and the trust was given to the Canadian government to live up to our treaties. Ever since the first treaties, First Nations have felt that Canadian officials have not complied with those treaties. So right now in 1946, they are not happy at all. 1939, going back a little bit here for the government's perspective, the economic adjustment of the Indians to modern life is a large problem. We need to make the Indians lead the normal life of the ordinary Canadian citizen. 1939 government perspective. Basically, they don't know what they're doing. They got to change and be like us. 1970 First Nations perspective. The perspective from Treaties 6, 7, and 8. To preserve our culture, it is necessary to preserve our status, rights, lands, and traditions. Our treaties are the basis of our rights. The treaties are historic, moral, and legal obligations. The government must declare that it accepts the treaties as binding. So 1970, they're going back to these original treaties, which again, we've already discussed have perspective issues with how the records were recorded. And now we got 1969, roughly the same time, government perspective. Canada cannot be a just society and keep discriminatory legislation on its status book. The barriers created by special legislation, such as treaties, can generally be struck down. The treaties need to be reviewed to see how they can be equitably ended. So right now, 1969, the government wants to completely get rid of the treaties, whereas in 1970, so again, roughly the same time here in years-wise, the First Nations are saying, no, these treaties are binding. We made these agreements years ago. They cannot go away. So huge differences right now in perspective. You can see how this, like it started off really well, and it just went downhill after the residential schools. 1980, First Nations perspective, from Treaties 4, 6, and 10. We, the First Nations, proclaim our dedication and commitment to the recognition of our unique history and destiny within Canada by entrenching, there's that word again, our treaty and Aboriginal rights within the Constitution. Only in this way can we truly fulfill the sacred obligation handed down to us by our forefathers for future generations. Anything less would result in the betrayal of our heritage and destiny. So this is First Nations perspective in 1980, basically saying the treaties need to be entrenched in the Constitution, just like our Charter of Rights is now. Okay, where it's now, there's no question they cannot be taken away. 1982, government perspective, the Constitution. This is actually Prime Minister, quote from Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father. I speak of a Canada where men and women of Aboriginal ancestry, of French and British heritage, of the diverse cultures of the world, demonstrate the will to share this land in peace, in justice, and with mutual respect. So, now in about 1980s, we see the relationship starting to become a bit more positive again. 2007, First Nations perspective on Treaties 6, 7, and 8. The chiefs of Treaties 6, 7, and 8 took out full-page advertisements in Alberta newspapers to mark the Aboriginal Day of June 29th, 2007. The advertisement stated that 1. First Nations negotiated the treaties to share the land so that First Nations people and non-First Nations people could both benefit. 2. Treaties were and are nation-to-nation agreements. And 3. First Nations were and are diverse peoples. The chiefs called on Canadians to lobby the federal government to recognize the true spirit and intent of the treaties. So now we're going back a little bit here again where the treaties might say one thing, at least in recorded record by the government, but now they're trying to figure out what was the actual intent. Like, what was the spirit and intent behind the treaties? 2005, government perspective. Moving forward will require a new partnership among us and a new relationship with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation. One based on mutual respect, responsibility, and accountability. We recognize the treaty and Aboriginal rights protected in our Constitution. This is the foundation of our relationship. Today, we reaffirm our commitment to renewing our approach to implementing self-government and treaties and to the resolution of Aboriginal rights to land and resources. So, 2000-ish now, 2007, 2005, 2007, they're starting to work together again, government and First Nations. And we're almost done. We are done this episode. In 2008, it's actually not in the textbook, so you can find that part on your own there, but it was the official residential school apology from the government. So take a look if you can find that one in 2008. That is it for Chapter 4, Episode 2. I know that was a big one, lots of reading, going through the numbered treaties and the different perspectives that the government and First Nations had throughout history. Even though it's the same treaty, the perspectives that two different sides can have profound impacts on the people's lives that it's part of. Thank you very much. See you next time.